A few years ago, scientists did something that had never been done before. They mapped African American DNA, not partially, not regionally, but across continents, tracing ancestry through West Africa, Central Africa, Europe, and the Americas simultaneously. What they found did not simply add detail to an existing story. It rewrote the foundational assumptions that historians, geneticists, and even African Americans themselves had carried for generations. The results were not what the standard model predicted. They were more complicated, more layered, and in the most important ways, more human than anyone had anticipated. The history of African Americans is one of the most documented and simultaneously most obscured histories in the modern world. Documented because the machinery of slavery kept records, ships, manifests, plantation logs, census entries. Obscured because those records tracked people as property, not as individuals with origins, lineages, and biological histories stretching back tens of thousands of years. The names were taken, the languages were suppressed. The connections to specific places on the African continent were systematically erased. For centuries, that erasure held. Then, ancient DNA entered the picture. And what the science returned was not a confirmation of what people assumed. It was something far more remarkable than that. Long before any ship crossed the Atlantic, long before any record was kept of who was taken or from where, the people whose descendants would become African Americans lived across one of the most genetically diverse regions on Earth. Africa is not an origin point. It is a continent of origins, plural, layered, ancient in ways that dwarf every other chapter of human prehistory. The populations of West and Central Africa, the regions that would supply the overwhelming majority of enslaved people to the Americas, had been genetically distinct, culturally complex, and extraordinarily diverse for tens of thousands of years before European contact. That fact matters. It matters because the story of African American DNA does not begin in 1619 on the coast of Virginia. It begins far earlier, in populations whose biological histories were already ancient when the slave trade started. The genetic record shows this with unusual clarity. West African populations alone represent some of the deepest human lineages on Earth, groups whose ancestors never left the continent, whose DNA carries variation that populations elsewhere lost through migration and founder effects over millennia. The Yoruba of Nigeria, the Akan of Ghana, the Wolof of Senegal, the Bakongo of Central Africa. These were not interchangeable populations. They were distinct peoples with distinct histories, distinct languages, distinct biological signatures. When the slave trade began pulling people from those communities and loading them onto ships, it was not drawing from a single homogeneous source. It was fracturing something irreplaceable. The DNA remembers what the records erased, and what it remembers is that the people taken were not from nowhere. They were from somewhere very specific, and that specificity survived. The Atlantic crossing was not a journey. It was a rupture. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, somewhere between 12 and 15 million Africans were loaded onto slave ships and transported across the ocean to the Americas. At least 1 in 6 did not survive the crossing. They died of disease, of shock, of violence, of deliberate starvation, and, in documented cases, of suicide. The ones who arrived were not the same people who had been taken. The Middle Passage did not simply move human beings across an ocean. It systematically destroyed the biological and cultural infrastructure that makes a people legible to themselves. Languages were mixed deliberately to prevent communication. Family members were separated at the point of sale. Ethnic identities that had structured entire civilizations were rendered meaningless by a system that recognized only one category: property. What the DNA captures from this period is the signature of that violence rendered in biology. Geneticists call it a bottleneck, a sudden, severe reduction in a population's genetic diversity caused by catastrophic loss. The Middle Passage created one of the most dramatic population bottlenecks in recorded human history. Millions of people were taken, but they were not taken evenly. Certain ports dominated the trade. Certain ethnic groups were targeted in certain eras. Certain regions were raided more heavily than others. The result was a founding African American population whose ancestry, while broad, was not a proportional sample of the continent. It was a fractured, compressed, violently curated selection. The ships kept records of cargo. They kept no records of lineage. That silence is what the DNA is now, centuries later, finally breaking. If the Middle Passage was the first compression, slavery itself was the second. For 2.5 centuries on American soil, the institution of slavery did not simply exploit African American labor. It actively reshaped African American biology. Plantation slavery operated as a closed genetic system in ways that left marks still visible in DNA today. Enslaved people were bought, sold, separated, and relocated according to the economic logic of their owners, not according to any human logic of family, community, or continuity. A man sold from Virginia to Louisiana lost not just his family. He lost the biological community his children would have grown up inside. Repeated across millions of lives across hundreds of years, that process produced a population whose genetic structure reflects not natural migration or organic community formation, but the systematic disruption of both. The DNA study captures something else from this period that the historical record had long obscured. Forced reproduction was not incidental to American slavery. It was policy. Black women were coerced into bearing children as early as age 13, and as frequently as the system demanded. The genetic consequence of that coercion is measurable. It introduced European ancestry into African American DNA, not through choice or cultural exchange, but through violence, concentrated in the plantation South, traceable in the genomes of descendants today. The legislation passed in 1807 to end the slave trade did not end slavery. It accelerated the domestic trade, moving people across state lines in waves, compressing ancestries further, severing connections that had survived the ocean crossing only to be broken again on American soil. The genome absorbed every rupture. It kept the record. It kept all of it. What the DNA mapping revealed when scientists finally sequenced African American genomes at continental scale was not a single clean ancestry. It was a layered biological archive that no historical document had ever fully captured. The primary signal was West African, as expected. Populations from Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, Sierra Leone, Angola, and the Congo Basin all appear with measurable frequency across African American genomes. But the proportions were not what the existing models had predicted, and the regional specificity was sharper than anyone had anticipated. Certain ancestries cluster geographically within the United States in ways that map directly onto the slave trade routes that historical records had only partially reconstructed. The DNA filled the gaps the documents left, but it was the unexpected signals that changed the conversation entirely. Buried inside African American genomes were ancestral contributions from regions that the standard account of the slave trade had underweighted. Central African lineages appeared more prominently than the port records suggested. Indigenous American ancestry surfaced in a meaningful percentage of African American genomes, a biological trace of unions and communities that official histories had largely erased. And the European ancestry, long acknowledged as a feature of African American DNA, turned out to be far more regionally concentrated and temporally specific than a general account of slavery could explain. It was not diffuse background noise accumulated randomly across centuries. It was structured. It pointed to specific places, specific periods, specific mechanisms of coercion that the historical record had documented incompletely, and the DNA now confirmed with uncomfortable precision. The hidden ancestry was never truly hidden. It was waiting in the biology for the science to arrive. The slave trade determined where African Americans arrived. Everything that happened after determined where they went. Between the late 19th century and the mid-20th century, in two massive successive waves that historians call the Great Migration, approximately 6 million African Americans left the rural South and moved to the industrial cities of the North and West: Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, Los Angeles. They were not fleeing poverty alone. They were fleeing a system of racial terror, sharecropping, disenfranchisement, and legal segregation that had replaced slavery in everything but name. They moved toward wages, toward anonymity, toward the possibility of something different. And in moving, they did something to the African American gene pool that the DNA mapping was able to track with remarkable precision. Migration reshapes populations biologically. When communities that had been geographically isolated from each other for generations suddenly intermix in a new urban environment, the genetic result is measurable. African Americans from Georgia married African Americans from Mississippi in Chicago apartments. Descendants of coastal Carolina plantations built families alongside descendants of Louisiana sugar country in Detroit factories. Ancestries that slavery had separated and scattered began recombining in northern cities in new configurations. The DNA mapping captured this recombination as a distinct signal, a layer of mixture sitting above the older strata of West African and plantation-era ancestry, datable to the 20th century, geographically traceable to the urban North. What the Great Migration did to African American culture, to music, to politics, to literature, is well documented. What it did to African American biology had never been mapped until now. The genomes of northern urban communities tell a different story than the genomes of the rural South. Both stories are African American. Neither is complete without the other. The system designed to erase African American identity failed, not partially, not in isolated pockets. It failed comprehensively, across generations, across geographies, across every mechanism it deployed. Languages were suppressed, but culture survived in music, in food, in oral tradition, in the precise way a community organized itself around grief and celebration. Family structures were deliberately destroyed by sale and separation, and yet kinship networks reformed, extended, adapted, carrying forward biological and cultural continuity through forms the system had not anticipated and could not fully disrupt. The DNA mapping reveals the biological dimension of that survival, with a clarity that no historical narrative had previously achieved. African American genomes did not simply absorb the trauma of erasure. They carried forward, intact, ancestry that the architects of slavery had specifically attempted to make untraceable. The resistance was not only cultural, it was biological in the most literal sense. Communities that maintained geographic stability across generations, the free black populations of the antebellum North, the historically black towns of the post-Reconstruction South, the tightly bound church communities that structured African American civic life for centuries, show distinct genetic signatures in the mapping data. Endogamy, the tendency of communities under external pressure to form families within themselves, preserved lineages that dispersal would have diluted. Marcus Garvey's movement in the 1920s, the largest mass mobilization of African Americans in the nation's history, was not only a political project, it was a declaration that identity was worth protecting, worth organizing around, worth crossing an ocean for if necessary. The DNA does not record intentions, but it records outcomes, and the outcome recorded in African American genomes is unambiguous. The identity survived. The biology is the proof. The implications of what the DNA mapping revealed do not stay inside a laboratory. They move outward into history, into politics, into the deeply personal question of who people are and where they come from. For African Americans, a population whose ancestral geography was deliberately destroyed as an instrument of dehumanization, the ability to point to a specific region, a specific ethnic group, a specific place on the African continent, and say, this is where part of me originates, is not an academic finding. It is a restoration. The science accomplished something that centuries of historical research, working from documents that recorded people as property, could not. It gave individuals a biological map to a past that had been confiscated. But the implications extend beyond the personal. The mapping reframes the historical record in ways that matter institutionally. The indigenous American ancestry appearing in African American genomes forces a reckoning with histories of contact, coexistence, and community between Black and Native populations that mainstream American history had systematically minimized. The precise geographic clustering of European ancestry forces, a confrontation with the specific mechanics of plantation-era sexual violence that polite historical accounts had long softened. The Central African lineages appearing more prominently than port records predicted force, a revision of the slave trade's own documentation, revealing gaps and distortions in the records that slaveholders kept. Barack Obama's election in 2008 was described at the time as a breakthrough in the political visibility of African Americans. The DNA mapping is a different kind of breakthrough, quieter, slower, but in some ways more fundamental. It does not change what happened. It makes what happened impossible to look away from. The record is in the biology now. It is not going anywhere. The descendants of that history are alive today. In Chicago and Atlanta, in Detroit and Houston, in the historically Black colleges of the South, and the housing projects of the urban North in the 56 million Americans who identified as African American at the turn of the 21st century. They carry in their DNA a biological record that survived the Middle Passage, survived 2.5 centuries of plantation slavery, survived Reconstruction's collapse and the terror that followed, survived the great dispersals and the determined erasures. The science did not create that record. It revealed it. And what it revealed is that the story of African American origins is not a story of absence. It is a story of extraordinary persistence. What ancient DNA accomplished here was more important than solving a genealogical puzzle. It humanized a history that the machinery of slavery had deliberately dehumanized. These were not displaced persons from an undifferentiated continent. They were Yoruba and Akan and Wolof and Bakongo. They were people with specific origins, specific biological histories, specific places that had been home for tens of thousands of years before any ship arrived. The mapping returned that specificity. It handed back what the slave trade had confiscated. The carved names on the walls of American memorials, the unmarked graves of plantation cemeteries, the census entries that listed human beings as fractions, none of them told the whole truth. The DNA does. And what it says, stated plainly, is that these people came from somewhere remarkable, survived something unsurvivable, and built something extraordinary on the other side of it. The biology is the record. It was always there. Now it can finally be read.